Nice. And now I want to talk about sound and unsound sacrifices. This is probably one of the hardest things to judge in chess because it has a lot to do with evaluating and assessing positions. So sometimes your opponents may have a threat that you're not sure if you should stop or not. For example, one of these ghost threats, as I like to call them, is bishop takes h3. Already at this point, White has to try and assess whether he should be scared about bishop takes h3 and play something like king h2 or queen f1, stopping it, or whether they should ignore it altogether. If they allow it, they have to be completely confident in their ability to defend after bishop takes h3 with all the threats that it'll bring on their king. Now, this is the typical type of sacrifices that my students love to play because they say, oh, I'm attacking, I'm going to go checkmate your king. It looks great, it looks fun. But we still have to be objective and try to understand whether the sacrifice is sound or not, which means that whether it works or it doesn't work. And nowadays with computers, this becomes really easy because a computer will tell you right away, oh, this doesn't work at all, or this works absolutely right away, or it's enough compensation for the bishop. And the computer just tells you right away. But before computers, we didn't know whether it was sound or not. And even now, you're not going to have a computer in a tournament game, hopefully, that'll tell you whether it's sound. And so we still have to try to understand it ourselves, for ourselves. All right, so let's take a look at the first example and see if it's sound. First of all, I want you guys to think whether this is a scary threat or not. All right, take 3 seconds, try to evaluate it. You can press pause in the video. Okay, and so the answer is no. It is not a sound sacrifice. Now, it looks tempting. It looks like the king opens up and you're only down 1 point because we got 2 pawns for the bishop. But that being said, we also have to look into the other factors. For example, does black have enough attackers nearby? Is there a bishop helping out the queen? No, this guy's not helping out. Can the knight really help? Yes, if he had some time, but even then the h2 and f2 squares are covered, so it's really not that scary. We shouldn't care about it that much unless they can bring in some more pieces, which calls for the rook. Can the rook come into the game? Not really. Can this knight come in? Way too far. Black's pieces are pretty ugly at the moment, whereas white's pieces are centralized. He's got a knight near the king, and he can stop immediate threats such as queen h2. And then the other question that white would have to pose is, long term, what would be his plan for defending against such a sacrifice? Because his king is permanently damaged, right? He's going to have permanent problems. Well, how can he stop these threats before they get overwhelming? Well, let's take a look. In the game, the bishop has to run back, and he would have to assess this position, whether it's holdable or not. The great news for white is that he gets a tempo on the knight, which has to run away, and that gives us the time to play something like knight g5, queen f1, queen g2, and protect the king altogether. The second you see a position like this in your calculation, you should just stop and say, that's it, the sacrifice is not going to work. No one's ever checkmating me now once I get the queen to g2, right? No rook is going to come into the g file or h file. Nothing's coming close to my king, and despite being a little bit weakened, he will live a long life, and with the extra piece, white should be able to convert this sacrifice for a win. Now, it isn't always so easy. But what did we have to do? We had to see immediate threats. We had to see their attacking possibilities. We had to see if they had any way to transfer the knight in here or use their pawns, and the answer was no. Our pieces were too good to allow such threats. And also, we had a concrete way to release the pressure. If you can release the pressure or find some way to trade off enough pieces, then you shouldn't be worried about the sacrifice. And so that's why in this game, white rightly played knight b3, allowing the sacrifice, which he was rewarded with later on winning the game. Now, in the next example, things aren't so easy for black. Let's take a look. Yates just put the knight on the 5 and said, what are you going to do? Are you going to take it? Can you accept my sacrifice? And Rubinstein had to evaluate whether taking it was possible or not, whether it was a sound sac or not. And the truth is, yes, it is a sound sacrifice. And this can be actually calculated very straightforwardly. Maybe not easily, it's not easy to calculate this, but Any good player with some time on their hands should be able to figure this out. Let's take a look at the variations. If I take with a pawn, they will take back. What is their immediate threat? Queen takes h7 because of the battery with the bishop. Now I need to cover the h7 square, right? I'll probably do so with the knight. This is the only real solution. Everything else, like king g7, just looks funny. If I have to play this move, and not to mention mate, it just looks funny. It shouldn't even be looked at. Knight f6 is the only serious reply. And then we have bishop g5 as a threat and bishop h6 as a threat. You would have to find a refutation against bishop g5 and make sure this is okay for us. And maybe this is actually okay after something like pawn to e4, maybe we survive, but bishop h6 is a lot harder to answer. The threat immediately is queen g5, so queen g5 is a scary square to cover, and h7 is a scary square to cover, which is currently covered by the knight, but if I want to cover g5, I lose control over h7. That means the king has to run away, and after the king runs away to h8, now they have this idea of bishop g5 coming back, since our king is now deserted on the king side, right? All his pieces are too far away from him. And this is just calculable. So we have to be very good at calculating in order to understand the sacrifices. And the only way we can really stop this threat is by pushing e4. But here the problem is very simple. Takes, bishop takes. Done. h7 is a undeniable threat. There is nothing that black can do to stop it. Now, the difference to this idea with bishop g5 right away is that maybe the king could have ran away in the other line. Maybe the king could run here, maybe. I'm not even sure about that, but there is a chance after queen takes h7 that we can survive. But in this line with bishop h6, there was no way we could do that, and so we can actually calculate this out to win for white, which is why black was a smart guy. He looked at all this and said, okay, good job, you made a sound sacrifice. Now I'm going to trade off all your pieces and ignore the knight altogether. Okay, so we have to try and assess these sacrifices by both positional factors, like do they have enough attackers and threats, and also calculations, such as in this variation which we looked at, is white winning? The answer was yes. Okay, by combining positional factors and calculation, you'll be able to make a good assessment of what's going on. All right, what about this example over here? Fischer was playing black against Keres. If you look at the position, it's pretty wild. It comes from a wild knight or variation where white is pushing e5, but black is just in time to cover their rook. Now, maybe white could just play queen g3 and life would go on as normal. But in this game, Keres decided to go even wilder and sacrifice his queen. Now, if we look at it from first glance, it looks like white gets two knights and a rook in exchange for a queen and a pawn. It looks like it. But then we see that black also has d5. And the only way to play this for black is actually d5. Otherwise, they're just down material, right? And white has this sacrifice. Now, once again, if black doesn't accept the bishop, he's just down material. That's why, one more thing, by the way, this would lead to check and knight e2. Right? That means white can keep the material, he is better. That's why if black wants to be better here, he has to take the bishop. And he has to be okay with this position. Now, he could take it right away, or he could take it with the inclusion of bishop takes d4. If we don't include bishop takes d4, things may actually look pretty bleak. Like, let's say the rook queen goes anywhere. We already have check, king of 8 looks forced, and then after knight c6, it starts to get a bit ugly. If nothing else, bishop takes f6 already has the, sorry, knight takes f6 already has the threat of back range checkmate. If you take this way, we already have rook d8, and white is winning on this spot because of his extra knight after queen takes, knight takes. Okay, so once we see that as black, we realize that taking the sacrifice right away is actually very sad. These variations look pretty bad, but if we include bishop takes d4 in there, then it's a different story, because now after rook takes, pawn takes, knight takes d5, the king is wide open, but he can actually survive as it happens. And in order to go for this whole sacrifice and even play bishop b7, Fischer would have to see that the sacrifice is not that strong as it seems at first sight. So after all these moves, which are basically forced, we get into this position. Now, how does Fischer realize that this is not that scary? Well, first of all, are there any immediate threats? After something like Queen c5, does White have a clear forcing win? Let's take a look. The rook e1 looks reasonable, bringing the last piece into the game. And then, of course, if we go something like this, then maybe it gets scary. Then the rook is looking at our king. They have all sorts of discovered attacks. Maybe they play c3, defend the rook, and get ready for some discovery, like knight f6 followed by rook e7 or rook d7, and it actually does get pretty scary since our king has no pawn cover. So because we look at this king running away and getting discovered, and we don't like that, and we say king f8 is better. Okay, what about this position? The rook is hanging on d4, so they have to play a move to defend it, like c3, because the rook actually stands pretty well here, and it wants to stay there. Now, what about this position as a whole? Is black in danger? Well, are there any mating threats? Not really. Any knight move with the idea of rook d8 can be met with g6, king g7. In the long term, can black get his pieces out? That's always the question when defending these sacrifices. Can we get our pieces out? Yes, the rook is coming out this way, whereas the king is coming to h7 in the future to hide away from the rooks. What about material? Well, black is doing quite well on material, even though it may be around equal, like if we count queen against a rook, knight, and a pawn as equal. But black is at least not getting checkmated, and in the long term, these pawns may get picked up by the queen. And when the rook gets out, we can trade off one pair of rooks, and then the queen actually becomes stronger, since this king is not so safe either, right? And we can attack him in the future. Let's take a look. h5, he gets the rook out. Keres tries to create more practical problems, keeping the rook in the game. Otherwise, he would just have rook d6 and it's game over. But despite these double pawns and the weakened king, it's okay. No one's going to checkmate him, right? There are no immediate scary threats. So black knows he's not going to get checkmated, and he can definitely go for this position. Even here, we can always play f5 and survive, right? And rook g8 is not a deadly threat, so we can make do, and we shouldn't be too scared of this attack on the 8th rank. Here, the king can run away this way, as Fischer figured out, and that's why Keres had to try and save what he could. Of course, we don't trade off the pawns. We want to keep the pawns on the board for black, and that's why the king runs away. I like this f5, king f6 idea. The king runs away, and suddenly we're just going into a winning endgame where all these black pawns will get promoted, and it's going to be very hard to stop them with your rook and awkward knight on e2. So once again, when defending against sacrifices, we have to think about, can we get our pieces out in the long term? Do they have any deadly threats that we can calculate right away? And what are their attacking ideas? Yeah, like here, the attacking ideas may be along the lines of knight f4 back rank, maybe the 7th rank with rook e7, rook d7. Maybe we should be concerned about knight f6, knight forks on d7. We should be concerned about the rook not getting out. Like imagine the white pawn ever got to g5, then that position is actually pretty scary. As it happens, here black got to solve all their problems. He got to take out all his pieces, and white's threats were not that scary because back rank can easily be stopped. Okay? Hope you can refuse your opponent's sacrifices in your game.